The signal arrived at 0340 hours, which was the hour when nothing good ever happened. Warden Commander Desta Ofosu was running diagnostics on the atmospheric processors when the console lit up. A distress pulse on the universal emergency band, the kind that made every translation algorithm on the ship agree on one word regardless of source language. Help. She stared at it for 3 seconds, then pulled up the trajectory datum and felt the weight of the decision settle into her shoulders, the way it always did. Like a second skeleton. Aria, distance to signal origin, 42,000 kilometers. The vessel is drifting. Life signs are confirmed, at least 6, but their biosignature spectrum is inconsistent with any species in our registry. The ship's intelligence paused, which it only did when it was choosing words carefully. I would characterize the vessel as distressed. You'd characterize a burning building as distressed. That is accurate. Yes. Desta told herself she was only going to look, just a visual pass. She'd been telling herself that for 16 years of deep patrol, and in 16 years it had never once been true. The Croton vessel was shaped like an elongated teardrop, its hull plating a deep copper green that caught the light of the distant star in ways that made it look almost organic, almost like something that breathed. 3 of its 4 engines were dark. The 4th pulsed irregularly, a heartbeat with arrhythmia. Desta brought the Ines Carvalho alongside and matched drift, and she was still composing the standard hailing message in her head when the airlock indicator on the alien ship cycled to green, and a suited figure emerged, moving with the careful deliberateness of someone who knew they were being watched and wanted to look as unthreatening as possible. The figure stopped 10 meters off the Croton hull and held its arms out, empty hands open, palms forward. It was a gesture so old it had no single inventor, something that said, across every language and every star system that had ever produced a species capable of reaching space, I am not holding anything. I mean you no harm. I am afraid and I am asking. Desta matched it. She opened the Carvalho's secondary airlock. Her name was Sahala, and she was the last surviving crew member of the Croton prison transport Vendora, and she was dying. Not dying in the dramatic sense. No blood, no visible wounds, but dying in the slow, efficient way that deep space had of taking things apart. Radiation exposure from a failed engine shielding. 2 of her people already gone. The 3rd, a woman named Clea, unconscious in the crew quarters, with a fever that had turned her dreams loud enough to hear through the bulkhead, and in the sealed cargo hold at the back of the ship, in a stasis pod that Sahala checked every 3 hours with the focused anxiety of someone sitting on top of something they could not afford to stop sitting on top of. A prisoner. His name is Dorzak, Sahala said. She sat across from Desta in the Carvalho's small medical bay, still in her environmental suit from the collarbone down, her hands wrapped around a bulb of heated nutrient broth that she hadn't drunk yet. He is of the Psychon people. His crimes, what he did on our world, what he did to my people before we could stop him. I don't have the vocabulary in your language. He used his mind. Do you understand me? He walked into our settlements, and he bent people. He took them and turned them into instruments of his will, and they could not resist, and they did not know it was happening until it was over. Desta kept her face still. A telepath. More than that. More complete. It is not hearing thoughts. It is, he reaches inside and rewires you. He rewrites the self. She finally drank from the broth. We lost 43 people before we identified him. We lost 11 more before we could take him. The only reason we were able to is because he was sick. A fever. An infection from something he caught on the surface. It lowered whatever it is he does. We got the suppression collar on him before he recovered. Where were you taking him? Exile. There is a dead moon in the Veth system. Uninhabited. Survivable. We were going to leave him with supplies and a beacon and not look back. She set down the broth. The engine failure was not an accident. I want you to know that. He is in stasis and has been since we left our system, but the Psychon can do things we do not fully understand. Whether he reached out even in that state, whether he touched Clea before we put him under, I have been asking myself that question for 9 days. Desta asked the question she already knew the answer to. You want to transfer him to my custody. I want him off my ship. I want him off my ship, and I want to get Clea to medical care that I cannot provide. Sahala looked at her steadily. I am asking you. I am not telling you. I understand that this is your vessel and your decision, but I want you to understand what I am asking you to carry. Desta spent 4 hours running every scan she had on the stasis pod before she agreed. The suppression collar was Croton engineering, not human, and her biomed systems couldn't fully interpret the readings. But the pod itself was straightforward, sealed, powered, functional. The figure inside it was tall, angular, with the kind of face that would have been beautiful if it were made of anything other than what it was made of. Even unconscious, even sealed behind 6 centimeters of stasis glass, there was something about the set of his features that made Desta not want to look directly at him. She transferred the pod to the Carvalho's secondary hold and welded additional restraints herself, while Arya provided moral support by reciting the statistical probability of stasis pod failures, which was very low, and then the statistical probability of the collar malfunctioning, which was also low, but not low enough for Desta's taste. "You should sleep," Arya said. "I should do a lot of things." She transferred Clea to her medical bay instead and sedated her properly and sat with her for a while because there was no one else to do it, and because the woman had a fever and a hand that kept reaching for something in her sleep, grasping at air. And Desta had a habit. Her crew had called it a problem, her commanding officers had called it an operational liability, her mother had called it the thing that would either make her or kill her, of staying with people who were in trouble. She made it 3 hours before Arya woke her with a tone that meant something had changed. The collar's suppressor had not failed. That was the first thing she checked. The pod was still sealed, still powered, still reading the appropriate vital signs for a being in forced suspension. But Clea was awake, and Clea was standing in the corridor outside the secondary hold, and Clea was holding Desta's own emergency override key, which had been locked in the medical bay cabinet. Desta came around the corner and stopped. She dealt with sleepwalkers, with post-sedation disorientation, with people doing things in crisis, states that they would have found incomprehensible under normal circumstances. She'd talked people down from ledges, literal ones, in 2 cases, and she'd long since learned that the worst thing you could do was move fast or speak loud. You came in low and even, and you made yourself unthreatening, and you found the part of the person that was still behind their own eyes, and you talked to that part. "Clee! Clee!" The woman turned. Her eyes were wrong, not blank, not empty, but too focused, pointed at something that wasn't in the room. She had the override key held out in front of her like an offering. "He needs to be awake," she said. Her voice was flat, the intonation too even. He told me he's been misunderstood. He wants to explain himself. He only wants to talk." Desta looked at the sealed hold door and thought about the scans she'd run and the readings she'd found reassuring, and felt the floor shift slightly under her assumptions. "Put it down, Clea. You don't understand what he is, what they did to him. They exiled him because he was right, because he saw things they couldn't." "That's his voice," Desta said. "That's not yours. I need you to find your own voices and use it." Something moved behind the woman's eyes. A flicker, a person surfacing. Desta crossed the distance fast, got a hand on Clea's wrist, and the override key dropped between them and clattered on the deck. Clea made a sound like someone waking from a nightmare, abrupt, confused, then ascending into horror as she understood what her own hands had been doing without her permission. Desta locked the key in a different cabinet. She sat with Clea for another 2 hours while the woman shook and wept and kept saying, "I didn't know. I couldn't feel him. I didn't know he was there." And Desta said what she could say honestly, which was not much, and what she could say truthfully, which was, "I believe you, and we're going to figure this out." She then went to find Sahala and told her exactly what had happened. Sahala listened without interrupting. When Desta finished, the Croton woman said simply, "The collar is not enough, evidently. He does not need to be awake. He reaches from suspension. I don't know how far. We assumed proximity was required, but we never fully tested it, because testing it required getting close enough to be affected." She paused. "On our world, before we identified him, there was a woman who drowned herself. She was found in a reservoir. She had been one of his closest friends. She was 17. We never proved it, but we knew." The silence in the Carvalho small common room was the specific silence of 2 people, looking at a problem that had no clean solution and knowing it. "How long to the Veth system?" Desta asked. 6 days at standard, less if your engines are faster than mine." 4 days. "Then 4 days, Sahala said. "But you should understand. He will spend those 4 days working. He will not waste them. He will be reaching for anyone on this ship he can reach." She looked at Desta directly. "He will find the seams. He always finds the seams." "Tell me about the seams," Desta said. "Tell me everything." She spent the next 18 hours making a manual record of everything Sahala could provide. The documented behaviors, the progression pattern, the ways he'd operated on the Croton settlements. She was not a neural specialist, and her ship was not equipped with countermeasures for telepathic intrusion. And the intelligence she was building was imperfect, partial, full of the gaps that came from studying something you couldn't fully observe without being changed by the observation. But she wrote it all down in a physical notebook with a physical pen because she wanted a record she could hold in her hands and verify with her eyes, a record that couldn't be subtly altered by something working through the ship's systems. She gave Arya a specific instruction. If the AI ever received a command from her that contradicted the standing orders written in the notebook, Arya should consider the command compromised. Understood, Arya said. I should note that I am not biological and cannot be influenced through the mechanism described. You're linked to biological users, and those users can give you commands. Yes. So act accordingly. She slept in 4-hour shifts. She checked on Clea every shift change. On the second day, she found Clea sitting up and eating, and almost herself, though she kept looking at the whole door with an expression Desta recognized as the one people wore when they wanted to describe something accurately and couldn't find the words for it. Is he like a sound? Desta asked. Is there something audible? Clea shook her head slowly. It's more like conviction. A feeling of certainty that arrives without your permission. You become sure of something, and the sureness feels like it came from inside you. And then later you realize the certainty was placed there like furniture in a room, and you never bought it, and you don't know when it arrived. She looked at her hands. I knew him before, back when before everything. He was extraordinary. He could talk for hours, and you would feel brilliant just for being in the same room, like the ideas were moving through you. I think that's why it worked. I think I had doors left open. Is there still a door? Clea was quiet for a long time. I don't know. On the third day, Desta noticed something. She was running the routine diagnostic she ran every 8 hours now. And the readings from the suppression collar were nominal, and the stasis readings were nominal. And she was about to close the display when something snagged her attention. A minor variation in the pod's thermal signature. Too small to trigger any alarm. Just a degree, maybe less, cycling in a pattern that was just slightly too regular to be mechanical noise. She stared at it for a long time. She got Sahala. They stared at it together. He's doing it deliberately, Sahala said quietly. He is awake enough to cycle the thermal output. He is breathing a pattern, which means the stasis is shallower than it should be, or always was. They sealed the hold, added secondary locks that required both their biometrics simultaneously to open, and Desta disconnected the pod from the ship's general power grid and switched it to an isolated battery system that wasn't linked to anything Arya could access. Then she sat outside the hold door with her notebook and thought about a dead moon in the Veth system and how far they still were from it. He communicated through Clea once more, on the 4th day, or tried to. Clea came to find Desta first and told her what she was feeling before it could build into action. Her face pale and her voice controlled and her hands slightly shaking, which was courage in Desta's estimation, the specific kind that required you to look at something inside yourself that you hadn't chosen and hadn't wanted and report it accurately anyway. They sat together in the common room, Desta and Clea and Sahala, and Desta read aloud from the notebook. Not because it would do anything, she didn't know if it would do anything, but because the sound of things written down by her own hand in her own words felt like an anchor, felt like the specific weight of her own mind in the room with her, the particular texture of her own thoughts, as opposed to anyone else's. My name is Desta Ofosu, she read aloud. Born in Accra, Earth. I have been in deep space service for 16 years. I like bad coffee and complicated navigation problems. I am not afraid of you. I am not interested in you. You do not have anything I want. Clea made a sound that was almost a laugh. Did you write that in the notebook? 2nd page. It's working, Clea said. And she sounded surprised, and Desta thought that the surprise itself was something. The sound of a person finding a foothold. They reached the Veth system on the morning of the 4th day, which was 2 hours ahead of schedule, because Desta had pushed the engines and let Arya complain about it. The dead moon was exactly as described. Gray-brown and cratered, and entirely inhospitable to any ambition, which was the point. They moved the pod with every precaution Desta could invent. and several that Sahala suggested and two that Clea proposed quietly from the doorway, because she knew him in ways the others didn't, and knowing a thing that could hurt you was still knowing it, still useful, still worth something. They set the pod on the surface, in a geological depression that would shelter it from the worst of the moon's radiation. They set a beacon so it would never be lost, and a supply cache, and a written record sealed in a case that could survive a century of exposure, containing everything Zahala and Desta between them knew about what he was and what he'd done, because the universe was large and the future was long, and someone might find him someday, and they deserved to tow what they were dealing with. The suppression collar would hold. It was built to hold without maintenance for 40 years, and 40 years was longer than Desta expected to be doing this job, longer than most things lasted. She stood on the surface of the dead moon while the Carvalho hung above her in the dark like a lantern, and she looked at the pod and the still face behind the glass. That angular, beautiful, terrible face. And she thought about Clea saying the certainty was placed there like furniture, and the woman who had drowned herself at 17, and the feeling of a mind reaching through sealed bulkheads in darkness and stasis to find the doors other people had left open. She thought about her notebook and the particular texture of her own thoughts. She thought about all the things that had ever been locked away in places like this and why, and whether the locking was justice or necessity, or just the name we give to the moments when we cannot do anything better. She sealed the beacon and walked back to her ship. Clea met her at the airlock. Sahala was already at the navigation console, plotting a course home, back to the Croton systems, back to the people who had sent her out, back to whatever it was that came after something like this. He spoke to me, Clea said, just before you walked back, just a push, asking me to go back down, to wake him, to tell you it was a mistake. Desta waited. I didn't feel it as mine, Clea said. I noticed the edge of it, the way it arrived without belonging. That's different from the first time. Yes, she looked at her hands again, and this time the looking wasn't horror. It was something more like inventory, taking stock, noting condition. I think you can learn to feel the seams from the outside. I think that's something. It is, Desta said. Come inside. The Carvalho broke orbit clean and fast. Below them the moon turned slowly in the dark, gray-brown and cratered. A place nothing wanted, holding the thing it was given, doing the silent, unglamorous, permanent work of keeping one thing from reaching another. Desta poured bad coffee from the common room dispensers and sat down with her notebook open on the table and wrote the date and the coordinates and the name of the place they had just been. And she wrote, "We held," and the seams held, and she drank her coffee and looked at Clea across the table, who was looking back, and neither of them said anything for a while because there was nothing that needed saying, and the quiet between them was just quiet. Just their own, not placed there by anything or anyone. Just the ordinary human silence of two people sitting in a room after something that had asked them to become something they didn't choose to be, and not having done that, having remained themselves, thoroughly and without exception, all the way through. Outside, the stars did not care. They never did. They simply burned. But the ship moved through them on its own course, choosing its heading, running its own lights, carrying forward the exact people it had set out with, unchanged in the ways that mattered, a little harder in the ways that helped, heading somewhere, and that was enough.